Hi everyone, I'm Jelly, also Nace DeSanders, and today I want to talk about why elevated horror absolutely does exist and you're all just being babies about it. Generally, my idea behind this is that elevated horror is a subgenre within horror, and the reason why people don't want to acknowledge it as such is because the term is elitist. What is elevated horror? Elevated horror exists in this kind of space a little bit before art house horror. So we have art house horror over here. We have maybe more standard studio horror over here. And then elevated horror probably exists somewhere in the middle of that, where we've got the scares, but we also have these deeper themes, a lot of character development, that kind of stuff. Elevated horror, yeah, sure, there might be some unexplained things, there might be some things that you don't understand, but the film is, for the most part, pretty straightforward. It's telling you what's happening. Whereas art house horror, A should explain, and there's no shame in finishing the film and being like, I have no idea what just happened. So art house horror, for some people, might get a little too esoteric, maybe a little too deep in the themes and the symbolic of it all. And I think people kind of get in the mix of that where they're like, I think some good examples of like art house horror versus elevated. Santa Sangre, that's a good art. I mean, everything this director does is very, very art house. Skinamarink, that's art house. I would say another more recent art house horror versus, because I keep naming ones from like the 70s. Climax. You watch it and it is not really flat out explaining to you everything that's going down. The narrative just isn't structured the way the words I want to say will just hint to, like, I want to leave it all until the very end where I tell you what my pitch is for the name. Like, once I say it, I feel like it's kind of obvious, so hopefully y'all agree with me. But I think it's undeniable that what is currently called elevated horror does dig deeper into those themes. That's my very surface level kind of different. We don't need to get super deep into the differences between these two subgenres. You just need to be able to go, okay, yeah, I can see that they're different. I think a lot of examples people give of elevated horror tends to be art house horror. Also, the people that use this term they tend to not be real horror fans. I just mean that there is a group of people that like elevated horror but don't like other horror films. And I think because that's how they feel, we want to dismiss their opinion. But I think because people hear the term elevated horror, they get upset and then they don't want to acknowledge anything else beyond that. Elevated horror is something different. Terrifier is different from Hereditary, and that's okay. We love that. That's fine. This is a subgenre that exists, and it just needs to be renamed. Horror has always existed in that middle space. Horror just is that middle space. No, there is no character development in Terrifier. There's not much character development in Saw. That's okay. One thing I really want to compare this to that I think is like a perfect comparison. I know a lot about horror, I know a lot about the film industry. I don't know a lot about music. Excuse me if I'm saying any of this wrong. But there is a subgenre of electronic music or dance music that is called intelligent dance music. That title is elitist to suggest that this subgenre is intelligent and the rest are dumb. In the name itself, yes, it is insulting, but there is something different about that genre. One of the artists that are in this intelligent dance music subgenre is Aphex Twin. I like their stuff. Other electronic music, other dance music sounds very different to Aphex Twin to me. And again, I don't know music, so I can't tell you how it's different. So I think my experience with this electronic music is where a lot of elevated horror fans live. Like, even though you're saying it is not any different, to me, someone that's on the outside looking in, they're clearly different. So it is a subgenre. It just needs a less insulting name. So to bring it back to elevated horror, there's a reason why they like elevated horror and don't like other horror films. There's a reason why this subgenre, why this grouping of films that we are pretending are just the same as everything else, why they just like that. And I think that's a really good sign that there is something different. And I think elevated horror is also coming at a time with a lot of trauma horror where, and I put that in quotes too, because like trauma horror would have meant something different before this like little age of elevated horror. I am not saying elevated horror is new. I know The Shining, I think, would be a good example. Jacob's Ladder. So Ari Aster's Hereditary is clearly elevated horror, and that is so very clearly different from Killer Clowns from Outer Space, or Drag Me to Hell, or Final Destination. We're not really diving deep into the themes of the inevitability of death. And if I was to make an elevated horror version of that, same storyline, but there would be long segments of us kind of pondering what this whole means, the inevitability of death, the meaning of life, like that kind of stuff would start coming in. What does death in this film as this like sentient force that has a sense of humor? Death in Final Destination has a sense of humor. That's something interesting, right? We'd get into that, and we don't in the Final Destination movies. And I'm fine with that. I love the Final Destination movies. I don't drive behind those trucks with logs, all right? No one does. Like, that's kind of the difference there, where we have not elevated horror Final Destination, and then the elevated horror version of Final Destination, more time for character development as well, and for exploring the themes, for exploring death itself more, how we feel about it. So here's my proposal for its new title. A film came out that was very similar to elevated horror, but it wasn't horror. It was sci-fi. This film is Ex Machina. We didn't call it elevated sci-fi though. Why? Because Ex Machina has those similar characteristics of elevated horror. The character Caleb and the actor Oscar Isaac just sit and talk about this kind of like nature of like nature versus nurture, and what we're programmed with, and the sentience of Ava, the AI. So this is kind of something that is a bit more elevated horror, right? But we didn't call it that. What is Ex Machina? What genre is that? Ex Machina is often given the subgenre of sci-fi drama because it has the genre element, the sci-fi, but deeper exploration of characters and themes. What does that come from? What genre is that? No, drama. If you take Ex Machina and you take all the sci-fi elements out of it, it's just two dudes and Ava. That's just a drama. So as you remember earlier in the film, I was having a hard time saying certain things about certain films, and that was because the word I wanted to use that I couldn't use earlier was drama. That's what elevated horror is. It's horror drama. And that is why you can have this group of people that say, I don't normally like horror, but I do like elevated horror. Why? Because they're more into drama. And this is a subgenre of horror that brings more drama into it. You take Hereditary, you take all the spooky cult out of it, you take, was it Paimon out of it, you take all of that out of it, it's just a drama. Rosemary's Baby, you get rid of that cult, it's just about a woman going through these issues with her pregnancy and not being believed by those around her. That's just a drama. You can eject the horror bit, and then what is left? There's still a genre left behind. Texas Chainsaw Massacre. You take out the horror, what's left? There is nothing left. You just have maybe just the little opening sequence when they're in the car, and then you'd have to end the film. It's a short film about kids in a car now. So to clarify, I'm not saying that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre isn't about anything. But there's practically no runtime dedicated to the cruel exploitation of animals and how scary it is to be food, which is something that I think the film touches on in like a really cool way. But the film doesn't do a deep dive into the topic, and thus we're not putting it in this category of quote unquote elevated. And not to say that these subgenres can't converge, of course. I can't think of any films where it does, but it hypothetically totally could. Like, we could have an elevated slasher for sure, quote unquote elevated slasher. So now let's go back to Final Destination. If I take the horror out of Final Destination, what is left? There's nothing left afterwards. If you take every scene with horror out of Final Destination, there is nothing left. Whereas with films that are considered quote-unquote elevated horror, which we're now calling horror drama, you take the horror out, there is a drama left behind. I'm not saying like the horror isn't necessary in these films. It's very necessary. It's part of the fabric of the film. I think if you deny that it's there, I think you're just being willfully obtuse. And I think if we just get rid of this elitist name and give it a name that makes more sense, we can move on. It's a subgenre that has always been here, and it just hasn't had a proper name yet. But before this little elevated horror boom that we've had, there wasn't a lot. There have been those films, but they weren't in abundance. Horror drama is my proposal to replace elevated horror. And if you were able to put your upset feelings about that term aside and like really hear me out, I do think that most people are going to agree with me. But if you don't agree, let me know in the comments. Let me know what you think is like flawed about what I'm coming up with here, because I think it's pretty solid.